The night near Vilnius was dark and cold. The forest stood motionless, as if it was waiting for what was going to happen in a few moments. There, among the wet earth and thin strips of frost, lay the twisted metal fragments of a Boeing 737-400 operated by Swift Air. The cockpit was torn apart, the wing was broken, and the debris spread through the forest for almost a quarter of a kilometer. The plane, which was supposed to perform a regular cargo flight, stopped 15 kilometers from the runway of Vilnius without reaching the lights of the airfield. There were 4 people on board, 2 pilots and 2 airline employees. There are 200 kilograms of dry ice and almost 400 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries in the cargo hold. This combination of loads requires strict temperature control and ventilation. Dry ice releases carbon dioxide during evaporation, and batteries need protection from overheating. All this is a common but extremely sensitive mixture for an overnight cargo flight. While the rescuers were still making their way through the forest, questions were already being asked in Europe. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz carefully uttered a phrase on the air, which instantly spread on the news. "We are studying this carefully. We can't say for sure at this point, but it could be the case." He talked about hybrid warfare, about methods of pressure that don't look like an open conflict, but leave enough disturbing traces to make the world think. But the Lithuanian Special Services reported the opposite in the very first hours. No traces of sabotage were found. No traces of explosives, no unauthorized access, no interference with the operation of the systems. Against the background of political statements, it sounded almost mundane, but it is precisely this kind of mundanity that always makes you look more closely at the flight itself. What could have brought the plane into the woods 15 kilometers before the runway? Technical failure? Crew error? Or a chain of small, seemingly insignificant decisions that have formed a critical combination? The answer wasn't in the rubble. He lay in the events that began to unfold long before the plane touched the treetops. To see the full picture, you need to go back to the very night when the crew was just preparing for departure, to the silence of the German airport, where the old Boeing 737-400 was slowly warming up its systems before a regular flight to Lithuania. Leipzig sleeps deeply. At 3 o'clock in the morning, on the platform of a huge cargo airport, there is that special silent hum that only happens on night flights. A loader is working somewhere far away, a metal ramp creaks, and the air is dense, cold with the smell of kerosene. The Boeing 737-400, which is more than 30 years old, is parked at the cargo terminal. Once it carried passengers, now it carries pallets and containers. Age is felt in every rivet, but technically the aircraft is serviceable. He was serviced, checked, and daily checked, the same daily check that is performed before each flight to make sure that even small systems are working correctly. The crew is also working on the usual autopilot mechanics that night. The commander is a 48-year-old pilot with a total flight time of about 5,500 hours. He spent just over 1,000 years on the Boeing 737, and that's enough to work confidently as a commander. On this flight, he performs the role of pilot monitoring. A pilot who is responsible for monitoring flight parameters, conducts radio exchange, monitors systems, but does not control the aircraft manually. Next to him is the co-pilot, 34 years old, a relatively young specialist. His total flight time is about 520 hours, of which less than 200 on a Boeing 737. For such an aircraft, this is the minimum level when the pilot is just beginning to feel the type. Today, he is a pilot flying, a person who physically controls an airplane. It includes working with the steering wheel, pedals, thrust handle, and responding to changes in course and altitude. He's at the helm here, but he's still learning how to feel the car, which is much more complex and heavier than anything he's piloted before. The night mode makes the situation worse. In physiology, This time is called the biological pit. Concentration is often lower than usual, the brain works a little slower, and minor operations require more effort. Pilots try to rest before night flights, but the body still reacts to the time of day. Cargo companies are used to night flights, but human nature remains about the same at such moments. The weather in Vilnius for this flight looks calm, but with nuances. Visibility is over 10 kilometers, which is great for the night. The wind is headwind with a side component about 9 meters per second is not critical, but it requires attention when landing. The temperature is only 1 degree Celsius. The dew point is -1. The difference between them is minimal, which means the humidity is high. And according to the forecast for the period from 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning, freezing rain is expected, the removal or formation of a thin film of ice on the surfaces of the aircraft. This request should be completed by the time the flight arrives, but a combination of factors, high humidity, low clouds, and cold, make icing a very real scenario. This information sounds like ordinary complexity, but that's how most critical events begin, with small deviations from the ideal scenario. Pilots check approach maps, discuss possible icing, and go through checklists. Everything looks expected and regular in advance, with no signs of an impending problem. When the Boeing 737 taxis onto the Leipzig runway, everything seems ordinary. Thrust increases, the engines enter takeoff mode. The aircraft accelerates and smoothly lifts off the runway. A few minutes later, it rises above the city, leaving behind the sparse lights of the night quarters. 20 minutes, and the crew occupies Echelon 330, about 10 kilometers high. The autopilot is on, the traction control is working, and the parameters are stable. The flight is going smoothly. The car is flying confidently. All systems are normal. Dispatchers give standard instructions. The cabin looks calm. The instruments show steady values, the radio airwaves are steady, and even the nighttime voltage is slightly receding. But it is here, at an altitude of 10,000 meters, that the future problem begins to take shape. It is not yet visible, audible, or marked in any way. The plane is moving perfectly, but the crew is already nearing the moment when they need to prepare for descent, the busiest stage of the night flight. And it is here that the first minor mistakes begin to occur. Inattention, small delays, errors with frequencies. Nothing critical yet, but it is with such small things that the chain begins, which will lead the plane to the forest near Vilnius. Everything really important will start a little later, when the crew starts preparing for the approach and accidentally takes an action that will change the entire course of the flight. When Vilnius is about an hour away from the flight, the cabin switches to a more assembled mode. The crew begins to prepare for the descent, a stage where work becomes intense and small things begin to play a key role. The co-pilot holds the controls, the commander controls the parameters and monitors the radio exchange. They discuss the weather situation, high humidity, low temperature, the likelihood of a thin layer of ice at altitudes below 7 kilometers. This is a standard conversation, but it sets the tone for the upcoming stage. The commander takes out a call card, the co-pilot gets a checklist. They go through the descent checklist, check the pressure in the air conditioning system, view the transition heights, and set the necessary settings. Everything looks disciplined, but one point is skipped: the calculation of landing characteristics. This is what is done before the approach, calculating the approach speed, the configuration of the mechanization, the length of the lane, the required braking distance. Skipping this step is not a mistake in its purest form, but it is the first missing element that others will later begin to attach to. When the crew tries to contact Vilnius for the first time, the dispatcher does not respond. The radio is quiet, and there is a pause in the cabin. The commander checks the frequency, repeats the call, silence again. The co-pilot holds the course, but periodically looks at his colleague, waiting for a decision. After a few seconds, it becomes clear that the frequency is set incorrectly. This error takes a minute, but the crew's attention is already beginning to split. First the weather, then the checklist, now the frequencies. These are all small processes, but they add up to one long, continuous stream of tasks. The commander adjusts the frequency, the crew establishes contact with the Warsaw Control Service, and then with the dispatchers of Vilnius. From there comes a new instruction, to descend to 3,000 meters. This is the transition to level 100, the standard altitude before transferring to the approach. Everything sounds confident in the commander's response, but the tension inside the cockpit is gradually growing. Descent requires precise vertical control, and the first signs of icing may appear when passing through cloud layers. The pilots know this, so the discussion of the de-icing system returns again. The crew carefully talks about the height at which ice may appear and when to turn on the anti-ice system, which warms the engine surfaces to prevent the formation of an ice crust. But in parallel, the commander has to catch several processes at once. Radio exchange, monitoring of parameters, preparation for new frequencies, control of decrease. This is cognitive overload, a situation where there is enough intelligence for each individual task, but their number begins to blunt the overall picture. A few minutes later, the dispatcher switches the plane to the next frequency, the approach of Vilnius. The commander confirms this, but almost immediately makes a mistake again and tries to get in touch on a different frequency. Thoughts get confused, memory fails, and the subtle rhythm of the cockpit increasingly resembles music in which the instruments are lost one by one. The co-pilot controls the descent at this time and keeps the aircraft in the desired configuration. The commander continues to work on the radio, explaining what is happening, but there is a slight absent-mindedness in his voice. At altitudes below 6 to 7 kilometers, they enter the zone of potential icing, and the conversation about anti-ice is becoming more relevant. The commander reaches for the upper panel, where there are toggle switches responsible for warming up the engines and for the hydraulic systems of the aircraft. He does this simultaneously with contacting the dispatch service, confirms the frequency, stretches out his hand, says the parameters aloud. This is where tasks overlap so tightly that the brain stops distinguishing where one process ends and another begins. And it is at this moment, when the air in the cabin is filled with cases, numbers, and switches, when control is divided between the experience of one and the nervous tension of the other, two almost imperceptible clicks pass through the voice recorder. Two short toggle switches that will be the starting point of everything that happens next. It's dark in the cabin. Only the instruments are shining. There are two rows of identical silver toggle switches on the top panel. Those responsible for de-icing the engines and those that control the hydraulic system B are located almost side by side. It's an ordinary night outside, and inside the cabin there are dozens of small tasks that pile up at the same time. Approach frequency, descent, speed, altitude, radio exchange. The commander reaches for the panel to turn on the anti-ice system, which warms up the engine shells and prevents the formation of ice deposits. He does this automatically because such operations are performed hundreds of times. At this point, two short clicks occur on the voice recorder, clicks that don't stand out in real time at all. They're only audible when listening to a recording, where any sound can be stopped, repeated, or slowed down. But immediately after these clicks, the pressure drop in the hydraulic circuit B is recorded on the parametric recorder. Then turn off the autopilot. A warning lights up on the panel. A master caution beep is triggered, a general signal indicating that some system requires attention. The hydraulic system B on the Boeing 737 is one of the two main circuits that drive the key controls. The right aileron, roll control, part of the elevator, one spoiler on each wing, and, most importantly, flaps work through it. Flaps are wing mechanization, metal panels that extend from the trailing edge and increase lift at low speeds. Landing is impossible without them. The plane will simply be too fast and will start to crumble when trying to maintain low speed. And without the hydraulic system B, it is impossible to use part of the wing brake elements, spoilers. They allow you to descend faster and help with leveling after landing. That is, the 2 clicks that were supposed to turn on the anti-device actually turned off the hydraulic system that provides half of the aircraft's controls and all the flap mechanization. The autopilot turns off immediately. This is a normal reaction of the aircraft. The system sees the loss of important elements and disables its modes. Control passes to the co-pilot. He now has to hold the plane with his hands alone, at altitude in the night sky under the control of the automatic thrust. A thrust automaton is a device that regulates the power of engines by moving the thrust levers so as to keep the selected speed. It works separately and does not depend on the disabled autopilot. Therefore, the plane flies with automatic thrust control, but without an autopilot, this is a difficult but normal mode. The crew tries to return the autopilot once, twice. The commander presses the power button, waits, but the system does not accept the command. She sees a problem in the hydraulics of B and does not allow the automatic control mode to be activated. But more importantly, the pilots are not yet aware of the true reason for the failure. In conditions of intensive work, it simply does not occur to them to think that they could accidentally turn off the hydraulic system themselves. The warning is on, but there is already a radio exchange going on in the cockpit, discussing the altitude and waiting for a new instruction. The commander is busy with the frequencies. He switches the radio again, confirms the numbers to the dispatcher again. The co-pilot is trying to stabilize the descent manually. He has little experience on the type, and at the same time he holds the steering wheel, monitors vertical speed, controls the glide path, and catches the course. Meanwhile, the hydraulic system B remains switched off. The flaps will not be able to exit. Spoilers will not be able to rise. The right aileron will work partially. The elevator system will receive less pressure. But the pilots don't see it yet. They look at big numbers, speed, altitude, course, and the necessary toggle switches remain at the top among dozens of identical switches without attracting attention. The plane flies as if everything is fine. The traction control keeps the set speed, the rudders are working, the controls are there. The problem is still hidden, and the crew is acting as if nothing has happened. The commander does not yet realize that in one of the most intense moments, he himself turned off the vital hydraulic system, and he continues to fly as if the plane is fully operational. And the next mistake is already waiting for its moment. The plane is already passing through the lower echelons, and the air is getting denser. There is a slight vibration in the cabin, a common occurrence when descending, but on a night like this, it adds extra tension. The co-pilot holds the steering wheel with both hands. Now he is the only one who controls the plane. The autopilot is disabled, and only the traction control is in operation, a system that moves the levers of the engines to maintain the selected speed. On paper, it looks simple, but in reality, it requires precise control. The steering wheel is in his hands, the pedals are under his feet, and the automation itself decides how much thrust to give at each moment. The commander is literally torn between tasks at this time. He tries to reach the desired frequency, confirms the dispatcher's instructions, checks the rate of descent, and discusses possible icing again. There is a growing pressure inside the cabin, as if each new signal is superimposed on top of the previous one, and none of them closes completely. Against this background, there is a moment that can be called a classic of the human factor. The co-pilot asks, "Is anti-device enabled?" It implies an engine de-icing system, one that prevents the formation of ice on the inlet edges. The commander answers confidently, "It's on." He doesn't even look at the toggle switches. This is a typical cross-check failure. When one crew member asks, another claims, but no one visually confirms. On the top panel, the device remains turned off. Hydraulic system B, which was accidentally turned off earlier, is also turned off, but the crew continues to work as if all systems are normal. The commander gives instructions to switch to the flaps 5 configuration, flaps to the 5-unit position. This is the standard configuration for the speed equalization stage before the final straight. In the recording, several clicks of the mechanization control knob can be heard. Everything looks right, but there is an important detail. The flaps are driven precisely through the hydraulic system B, and it's turned off. The flaps remain in the thrust position, and this changes the entire aerodynamics of the aircraft. Without them, the car will fly faster than it needs to, and attempts to slow down will only increase the angle of attack, the angle between the direction of travel and the direction of the nose of the aircraft. The greater this angle, the higher the risk of stall when the wing stops generating lift. But the crew doesn't notice it. They hear clicks, see the standard pattern of devices, and continue to work according to the procedure. The commander uses aerodynamic spoiler brakes that extend on the upper surface of the wing to increase drag and reduce speed. But spoilers also work through the B hydraulic system. They don't come out. The plane starts to go down the glide path faster than it should. On the turn to the landing course, the Boeing goes off to the side by about 1.5 kilometers, too much deviation to stay within the normal range. At that moment, the commander had to make a decision to leave for the second round or request to stand in the waiting area. But he was busy with radio exchange. Confirms the frequency, but confirms the wrong one. The dispatcher gives them an operating frequency of 118.5, and the commander repeats a different value, another mistake that seems small but collects extra seconds. The dispatchers are trying to get in touch. Multiple calls, none of which receive a response. In the cockpit, the crew continues to work, but is already noticeably lagging behind the aircraft. Pilots call this state being behind the airplane. When events develop faster than you can process them. For the first time, the copilot notices that the flaps have not come out. This happens at the final stage, literally seconds before alignment. At the same moment, the steering wheel shake warning stick shaker is triggered. This is a vibration that warns of an approaching stall. The wing is about to lose efficiency. Then there is a voice warning about a critical drop. The plane is already at an altitude where every second is critical. And only now, seeing the lights of the lane ahead, the crew finally understands. Mechanization is not where it should be. Flaps are removed. Spoilers don't work. The speed is too high. The configuration of the aircraft is unsuitable for a safe landing. And there is less time for correction than for one deep breath. The final section of the glide path is always the densest in terms of load, but this time it comes as a complete surprise to the crew. The plane is too fast. Without flaps, the wing generates less lift at low speed, so the Boeing is forced to go faster than normal. At the same time, the traction control keeps the engines almost at a minimum, the mode when thrust is minimal and the reaction to an increase in RPM is slowed down. This combination makes the landing configuration unstable. Low gas, high speed, removed mechanization, the aerodynamics of the aircraft no longer correspond to the standard approach scenario. The next seconds turn into a sequence of warnings. The first trigger is the steering wheel shake stick shaker. This is a system that not only sends a signal, but physically vibrates the steering wheel, warning the pilots that the wing is close to the limit of stable flight. Immediately after that, a voice message about a critical drop sounds. It reminds the crew that the angle of attack, the angle between the direction of the airflow and the direction of the nose, is becoming too large. In such conditions, any deviation, even a small one, quickly brings the aircraft to the stall boundary. The Boeing continues to descend, and the crew understands that they need to go on a second lap. The decision was made on time, but the implementation takes place too late. The co-pilot presses the toga button, the forward-up mode, which should bring the aircraft back to climb. The traction control instantly switches the engine levers to the maximum power position. But that's where physics comes in. The turbojet engines on the Boeing 737 do not provide maximum thrust immediately. With low gas, they need time to unwind the compressors, increase the fuel supply, and stabilize the parameters. The difference between the minimum and maximum mode is a few seconds, which normally do not matter. But on the final section of the glide path, at low altitude and with a high rate of descent, these seconds become crucial. The aircraft is already at a high angle of attack, and after toga is activated, it begins to lift its nose even higher. This increases the disruption of the flow on the wings. When the wing stalls, it ceases to create sufficient lift and loses the ability to keep the aircraft in the air. Under normal conditions, the pilot must reduce the angle of attack, lower the nose to restore the flow of the wing. But at this moment, the ground is too close, and the crew is trying to gain altitude rather than lose it. The engines begin to unwind, but the aircraft has already reached the point of no return. Lift is falling, vertical speed is increasing, roll control is becoming less effective. Without flaps and without a working hydraulic system, the ailerons react worse. When the wing begins to crumble, the device goes into a slight roll, which quickly increases. At a distance of about 1.5 kilometers from the runway, the Boeing collides with the treetops. The impact occurs in the right wing, the aircraft turns around, and the fuselage breaks into several large sections. The fuel lines are damaged, and a fire occurs. The debris is scattered through the forest for almost 230 meters. Several fragments fall into the residential area. The roofs of several houses are partially destroyed. The picture in the forest looks like a torn metal trail. Pieces of skin, parts of a wing, remains of a cabin, cargo containers. The lights of the rescuers are still far away, and the night is returning to its former silence again. Only now the crackling of metal and fire can be heard in this silence. At the same time, a few kilometers away, 2 other planes are already queuing for departure at the Vilnius tower. The dispatcher looks at the screen and suddenly utters a phrase that he will never forget. There was a crash on the direct line. I forbid launch. This short phrase becomes the boundary between two realities. The one where the Boeing is approaching the runway, and the one where the swift air flight no longer exists as an airplane, only as a point on the map and a chain of decisions that led to the forest near Vilnius. The Vilnius tower's radio airwaves seem to freeze at that moment. The controllers have just been working in the usual rhythm. One flight is preparing for departure, the second is finishing taxiing, and the third is receiving permission to take off. But everything ends in one short phrase. There was a crash on a straight line. I forbid the launch. The dispatcher's voice is even, but you can hear that he is not speaking mechanically, but with exaggerated attention, as if the words themselves were supposed to keep the situation from further chaos. Planes that were already preparing to start their engines are instructed to return to the parking lot. One of the pilots asks, "Which plane?" The short answer is Boeing 737, and there comes that silence on the air, in which absolutely everything is clear. The board, which was in the air and awaiting approach, is instructed to gain altitude and go to the alternate airfield, Riga. A void appears on the dispatcher's radars near Vilnius. The dot that was moving towards the runway a minute ago is no longer responding. The airport is closing. Flights are stopping. The broadcast becomes quiet. Only short official phrases remain in it, and each one sounds like a shot in the void. In a few minutes, the first fire brigades and police cars leave. They are not moving towards the runway, but towards the dark forest where the plane crashed. Drivers are forced to check the coordinates. The crash site is located deep in the landings, where there are no direct driveways. Flashing beacons reflect off wet tree trunks. The rescuers have to walk further. In the forest, the smell of burning metal mixes with the smell of pine needles. The wreckage is scattered over hundreds of meters. Fragments of a wing, cargo containers, and parts of the fuselage. And in the midst of all this is a man. One of the airline's employees was thrown out at the time of the plane's destruction. He is conscious, disoriented, speaks Lithuanian, and repeats the same thing. There are 3 more people there, 2 Spanish pilots and another employee, a German. After a short time, rescuers find all 3 of them. One of the pilots shows no signs of life. The other 3 were seriously injured. They are evacuated to ambulances. In such situations, every minute decides whether they will be taken to the hospital in time. On the ground, not a single person was injured, although several pieces of debris pierced the roofs of houses. Residents take to the streets in their nightgowns, not understanding what exactly happened, seeing flames in front of them among the trees. 44 minutes after the crash, the Lithuanian Ministry of Justice's Department for the Investigation of Transport Accidents is notified of the incident. This is the formal start of the investigation. But the informal part starts earlier. The first assumptions are already appearing in the media. The headlines are loud: hybrid attack, cargo problem, or human factor. Politicians in Europe are discussing the version of outside interference. Somewhere there is a mention of lithium-ion batteries. Somewhere there is dry ice. But at that moment, no one yet knows that the real reason is not hidden in substances, not in the weather, and not in politics. It's hidden in the cabin, in several adjacent toggle switches on the top panel which look the same and differ only in which direction the pilot moves the switch. And when the investigators get to the wreckage of the panel and the recorders, it will become clear. They are not looking for the answer there. He's not in a hybrid war, but in a few centimeters of metal. BY morning. The crash site is surrounded by ribbons, searchlights, and investigators. The forest, which was dark and soft until recently, now seems alien. Each tree is illuminated by multicolored flashes of headlights and portable lamps. Against the backdrop of twisted metal, experts begin what always becomes the most difficult stage: reconstructing the chain of events in the footsteps left by the machine itself. The preliminary report appears quickly. There are no final conclusions in it. Investigations of this level take months. But already in the early days, the investigators find something that dramatically changes the direction of the study. A part of the upper panel is found among the fragments of the cabin. The positions of several toggle switches have been preserved on it. The switches of the hydraulic system B are in the OFF position. At the same time, the technical condition of the hydraulic system itself, according to the results of the study of its components, is fully functional. There are no signs of destruction, overheating, fluid loss, or mechanical damage. The system wasn't shut down because of a failure, it was turned off manually. This finding coincides with what the flight recorders record. There are 2 short clicks on the voice recorder, recorded just before the pressure drop in hydraulic system B. The parametric one shows how the pressure drops a fraction of a second after these clicks. Then the autopilot turns off. The master warning lights up, but the crew's reaction is limited to a short press on the warning mute button. The reason is not recognized. The recordings show other things as well. The commander gives the command to release the flaps. The co-pilot moves the lever. Characteristic clicks are heard, but the position of the flaps remains 0. The system cannot set the mechanization in motion without hydraulic power. A few minutes later, the crew tries to use spoilers, again without reaction. But at altitude, in the dark, and under conditions of cognitive overload, all this is perceived as something is wrong, but not as a specific technical reason. The investigators proceed to analyze the ergonomics of the panel. On the classic generation Boeing 737, to which this aircraft belongs, the engine anti-device toggle switches are located next to the hydraulic system toggle switches. They are the same size, and they have the opposite direction of travel. To turn on the anti-device, you need to push the switch forward, away from yourself. To turn it off, pull it back. But for hydraulic systems, the opposite is true, on down, off, up. Two adjacent rows of identical metal levers, two opposite directions of movement, and one hand which makes the usual movement at the moment of overload, but not according to the same pattern. The investigators note that the hydraulic system shutdown occurred at the very moment when the commander was confirming the frequency to the dispatcher. His attention was divided between radio exchange, descent control, icing discussions, and switching systems. This is a classic situation where the brain chooses an automatic action without visually checking the position of the toggle switches. Such moments have been studied in aviation psychophysiology for decades. When the cognitive load exceeds a threshold, a person switches to automatic mode and acts according to a pattern. The recordings of the recorders show that the crew did not understand exactly what had happened for several minutes. The autopilot suddenly shut down. The flaps are not responding. Spoilers don't work. But at that moment, the experienced commander did not analyze the panel, but continued to switch frequencies, accept the dispatcher's instructions, and tell the co-pilot what to do next. The brain processed the flow of tasks, but did not look for the root cause. And here the main question arises: why did a pilot with more than 1,000 hours of experience on a Boeing 737 confuse the toggle switches? Why was he sure he was turning on the device but actually turned off the hydraulic system? The investigators find the answer deeper, not in the structure of the aircraft, but in the structure of human skills. The commander flew the ATR-72 before switching to Boeing. On many European aircraft, the logic of turning on the systems is reversed: turning on up, turning off down. What a hand does hundreds of times in a previous career often defeats even formal training for a new type. Especially at night, with fatigue errors, under the pressure of radio transmission and approaching icing. This transfer of motor skills is one of the most difficult and unobvious dangers in aviation. And the investigators understand that the reason is not only in the panel. It's in a memory mechanism that preserves old movements deeper than they seem. But the main conclusion will be formulated a little later, in separate blocks of the report. Now they are faced with the following question: why could an experienced commander even confuse where to turn on and where to turn off? And the answer lies in his past flight and in how the brain remembers familiar movements. When the investigators get to the details of the top panel, the picture begins to take shape into something much more human than technical. On the Boeing 737, the hydraulic toggle switches are located next to the anti-device toggle switches, and they look almost identical. But the main difference is in the direction of their movement. On Boeing's, switching on is most often done down, switching off is done up. On many European and Russian aircraft, the logic is reversed: turn on up, turn off down. This is a small but fundamental difference, embedded in the pilot's motor memory. The commander had previously flown the ATR-72, a turboprop European aircraft, for several years, where the logic of the switches is different. There, the hand automatically moves up when you need to activate the system, and down when you need to disable it. This movement is reinforced by thousands of flights, training sessions, and procedures. It runs so deep that it becomes automatism. And even after switching to a new type of aircraft, the brain, under the pressure of the load, chooses exactly this old, well-known pattern. This phenomenon is known as motor skill transfer. It manifests itself when a person learns a new system, but under stress automatically returns to the previous pattern of movements. Pilots say that motor memory is the pilot within the pilot. Someone who makes a move faster than consciousness has time to check it. This usually helps, it simplifies the work. But in conditions of high load, motor memory can play against a person. At the moment when the commander was reaching to turn on the device, his attention was simultaneously on the dispatcher, lowering and discussing icing. At that moment, the brain was not checking every action with its eyes. It was doing as usual. And the usual turn-on from the ATR-72 aircraft turns into the opposite effect on the Boeing. The toggle switch of the hydraulic system goes to the OFF position. But why didn't an experienced pilot notice the mistake right away? This is where an effect that pilots call tunnel vision comes into play. This is a state in which consciousness focuses on one process, ignoring everything else. It occurs in conditions of overload, when the information flow is too dense. Everything that does not relate to the current priority task, the brain simply stops perceiving. Any training center shows this on simulators. A pilot can perform a difficult maneuver, but not notice the bright warning board right in front of him. Not because he isn't looking, but because his attention is captured by a critical parameter: speed, altitude, frequency, and radio communication. At this point, even a large warning on the panel can become invisible. The Swift Air case confirms this literally line by line. After 2 clicks of the toggle switches on the panel, the yellow low-pressure display of the hydraulic system lights up. The textbook says, "It's impossible to see." The glows, vibrates, stands out from the rest. But the crew does not react to this. The commander presses the button to turn off the general warning, and that's it. The problem has been visually confirmed, but the cause has not been sorted out. Interestingly, in the comments of current Boeing 737 pilots, there are often stories about how easy it is to confuse the toggle switches of the hydraulic system and the anti-device. This is called the classic cabin error. Many admit that they made such erroneous movements themselves in the simulators, but the cross-check, the cross-control of 2 pilots always saved the situation. One speaks the command, the second executes and pronounces, the first confirms. Nothing is done in silence. But that night in the cabin of the Swift Air, this mechanism malfunctioned. The co-pilot didn't ask, "I confirm the anti-device is enabled." The commander did not look at the toggle switches. And motor memory did its job, quietly, instantly, without the slightest doubt. And then tunnel vision emerged. The overload from frequencies, communications, declines, and weather narrowed attention to a single line of action. At this point, even an experienced commander is not acting as an analyst, but as an operator who is trying to keep up with the speed of what is happening. And here we come to the most painful issue of this flight, the interaction inside the cabin and the quality of crew training. To understand what happened in the Swift Air cabin, it is important to disassemble the foundation, CRM, or crew resource management. It's a set of rules that describe how 2 pilots should work together. Who says the command, who executes it, who controls the result. In a 2-member crew, everything is based on a clear division of roles. Pilot flying controls the aircraft, steering wheel, pedals, altitude, heading. Pilot monitoring monitors parameters, radio traffic systems, and most importantly, monitors every action of the pilot. The command should be flaps 5. The co-pilot responds with flaps 5, moves the lever, looks at the indicator, says 5 is set. Pilot flying confirms checked. This scheme creates a triple error filter, order execution verification. None of these filters worked that night. The commander gave commands to release the flaps and clean the brakes, but there was no confirmation in the cockpit. The co-pilot was moving the levers, but no one was looking at the flap position indicator. If at least one of them had looked at the indicator, he would have seen that the arrow of the flaps remained at 0. The mechanization had not gone out. That would be the moment of truth. But under conditions of overload, the eyes glided past the devices, and the brain did not connect actions with consequences. Another foundation of CRM is the analysis of warnings. Any flashing or audible warning should lead to an analysis of the cause. But in this cabin, the master caution was extinguished by pressing a button without looking at the panel that the lamp was pointing at. Under normal conditions, such a step is impossible. But at night, on descent, under the pressure of many tasks, the pilots did not act according to the algorithm, but instinctively trying to get rid of at least one irritant. Another broken element of CRM is the implementation of mandatory procedures. The landing checklist card must be read before boarding. This is a control card confirming the release of landing gear, flaps, system configuration, and aircraft readiness for the final stage. The crew did not read it. This deprived them of their last chance to discover that the flaps had not come out. After all, there is a point in the checklist where pilots are required to check the mechanization position indicator. But the most difficult element of this story remains the experience of the co-pilot. He had only about 200 hours on the Boeing 737, which is the minimum level when the pilot is still getting used to the model. And it was he who was flying the plane manually when the autopilot turned off. This is not a simulator or a training flight. It is a night approach in difficult conditions under the threat of icing, with a lot of radio traffic and the loss of a critical hydraulic system. The commander could do several things that would reduce the workload. He could have taken over the controls, put the flight into a mode where a more experienced pilot was holding the helm. He could have turned on the second set of autopilot. There are 2 on Boeing, and the failure of one does not mean that the other is unavailable. He could ask the dispatcher to put them in the waiting area, to fly in a circle for a few minutes at a safe altitude, stabilize the parameters, complete the checklists, find the problem. But none of these decisions have been made. When the crew decided to go on the second lap, they had a chance. The co-pilot activated toga mode, which should automatically set the desired departure trajectory. The nose of the aircraft rises, the engines increase thrust. But it's not enough to press the button to leave correctly. It is necessary to maintain the correct pitch, the angle of elevation of the nose, usually about 15 degrees. The pitch was not set that night. The plane continued to descend because the steering wheel was not taken over with the necessary effort. The engines did not have time to reach maximum power. The plane remained in drop mode, and toga mode only lifted the nose, further increasing the angle of attack and bringing the stall closer. And all this is not the result of a single mistake, but a loss of interaction. CRM has completely collapsed. The teams are wrong. There is no control, checklists are missed, roles are mixed, priorities are lost. But the responsibility doesn't end with the 2 people in the cockpit. The question is, who allowed such a crew with such a level of training, with such a distribution of experience, to be on such an airplane on such a night? When talking about disasters is reduced only to the mistakes of the crew, it always seems that the story is over, the pilots did it wrong. But in aviation, nothing exists in isolation. Pilots are part of a large system that shapes their behavior, distributes workload, schedules flights, and monitors qualifications. And if the system fails, errors in the cockpit become not an exception, but a pattern. Swift Air is a company operating in a strict rhythm of cargo transportation. Night flights are the norm, not the exception. This means that crews are often in conditions of a biorhythm shift, work during periods of least physiological activity, and fly flights where the main goal is to deliver cargo by a certain hour. Cargo aviation rarely has the luxury of long vacations and perfect shifts. The crew planning system plays a key role. Ideally, there are two pilots of comparable level in the cockpit, or when a young co-pilot is placed with a commander who has extensive experience. But at Swift Air that night, there was a pilot at the helm who had about 200 hours on a Boeing, a training volume. And next to him is the commander, who also did not have tens of thousands of hours on the type. Such a crew should not have conducted a difficult night approach with the risk of icing, but the system allowed it. Proficiency testing is also part of this picture. Formally, pilots undergo annual checks, training sessions, and medical examinations. But the reality is that the quality of training can vary from airline to airline. Instructors admit that sometimes pilots go through checks in advance. They are signed without requiring perfect procedures. Such checks create the illusion of competence, but under stress, everything that is written only on paper is destroyed. There is an important contrast that breaks the popular stereotype. In Russia, the requirements for knowledge, medical indicators, procedures, and the implementation of RPE, operating instructions, are often stricter than in some Western companies. This is a fact that often surprises those who believe in the formula foreigners are always better. In fact, everything depends not on the passport, but on the quality of the training, the culture of the company, and the level of control. The role of dispatchers in this story should also not be underestimated. Their tasks do not include monitoring the deviations of the aircraft from the glide path. This responsibility lies entirely with the crew. The dispatcher can only transmit information about the lane, the weather, or other activity. He doesn't have to be a third pilot. And when the Swift Air flight went 1.5 kilometers away, the crew should have discovered it, not the dispatcher. Another nuance is radio frequencies. European frequencies with 3 digits after the decimal point add additional cognitive load. Under stress, pilots are more likely to get confused between 118.705 and 120.705. The commander did exactly that night. An incorrectly confirmed frequency led to the crew trying several times to contact the tower on the wrong channel. The dispatchers tried to call the Swift Air flight several times, and no one answered, but the dispatcher cannot know that there is an emergency in the cabin. All he sees is the plane that was supposed to make contact, but it's not responding. He can only repeat the call and inform other planes that takeoffs are prohibited. That night, the controllers did everything they had to do, but their role is limited by the rules that exist precisely so that they do not interfere with the control of the aircraft. The system around the crew is not just instruments and instructions. This is the culture within the company: workload, shift planning, quality of training, discipline, and interaction of all participants in the flight. And when at least one element is not working properly, the chain of incidents becomes longer. And yet, there are not only accusations in this story, but also lessons. Lessons that are repeated over and over again in various disasters. From Kazan to Vilnius. As the investigation reaches its final stages, it becomes clear that the cause of this disaster is not hidden in a single mistake. She is in a chain of events that stretched from Leipzig to the forest near Vilnius. Night flight during the most physiologically difficult period for concentration. Fatigue that cannot be fully compensated for even by an ideal sleep schedule. An inexperienced co-pilot who was entrusted with manual control during a difficult phase of the flight. A commander overwhelmed by radio traffic, frequencies, declines, and the threat of icing. Missed calculation of landing characteristics. Several incorrect frequency confirmations. 2 erroneous hand movements that turned off the hydraulic system B. Outstanding checklists. The flaps that didn't come out. Spoilers that have remained in place. An attempt to leave without proper pitch. And the engines which just didn't have enough seconds to reach maximum power. Each element individually is not critical. Any of them could have happened on another flight and ended in nothing. But together they broke through all the levels of that Swiss cheese. A security model in which several layers of protection overlap each other, preventing small mistakes from becoming big ones. That night, all the layers matched. Everything that was supposed to protect the crew and the car turned out to be shifted, turned off, missed, or ignored, not intentionally, but under the pressure of a real working environment, where seconds and attention are not distributed perfectly, but as the human psyche allows. This case was a reminder of several fundamental things. It's about how important the cabin design and the location of the controls are. One row of identical toggle switches can be a fatal decision. That CRM is not a formality, but a lifeline. The command must be clear, the execution must be confirmed, and the result must be checked with the eyes. That cruise should be based on experience, not on a schedule. A young pilot should not fly an airplane in critical conditions without support. And that the culture of stop, let's go to the second round, let's figure it out should be the norm, not a sign of weakness. Every minute of stabilization in the air gives you a chance to see what you might miss in the heat of the moment. But the main image remains the same. There are two identical toggle switches on the top panel, two metal levers, differing only in the direction of movement. And in the forest 15 kilometers from Vilnius, there are wreckage of the plane, which will be found by rescuers and local residents for a long time. The whole history of this flight is between them. And this is not the only story where a small action has led to huge consequences. There are many such episodes in aviation, and each of them reveals its own part of the overall picture. We will continue to analyze them to understand how this system works and why one hand movement can change everything.